Like World War I, the United States promised a better world after World War II. The United States, under Roosevelt, had convinced Winston Churchill to sign on to the Atlantic Charter, that this war would be about 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom from want, freedom from fear. That this would be the end of empire building. This would be the end of great power politic. Instead, it would be a period in which big and small alike could exercise their right to self-determination. Secretly, however, Winston Churchill met with Joseph Stalin in Moscow in 1944. Churchill and Stalin worked out what is called the Percentage Agreement, in which the British and the Russians divided Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And so here you see the handwritten notes by Churchill that Romania would be divided 90% for the Soviet Union, 10% for Great Britain. On the other hand, Greece would be 90% for Great Britain, 10% for the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 90% Russian, 10% Great Britain. In other words, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin were treating the new world just like the old world. To the victor go the spoils. This laid the foundation for an agreement at Yalta in 1945. By February 1945, it was pretty clear that the war was coming to an end. And so this time, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin all sat down together and agreed to the Percentage Agreement on a grander scale, that the world would be divided by zones of occupation. Instead of trying to figure out percentages on paper, the reality of the ground war would determine who had control of the region. Whichever army had control on the ground, that power would be in control of the post-war rebuilding. Since Soviet armies came in from the east, the Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe. Since American and British forces came in from the west, American and British forces dominated Western Europe. This was simply a practical solution to a problem. Neither the United States nor Great Britain wanted Soviet troops in Western Europe, and the Soviet Union did not want American and British forces in Eastern Europe. Even with the cooperation that had built up during the war, both sides remained skeptical that the other would keep their promises. The mistrust among the Allies continued to build at Potsdam. The Potsdam Conference lasted from July 17 to August 2, 1945. This was after VE Day, Victory in Europe. In May, the Allies took control of all of Europe, and Hitler had committed suicide. The war was over. The war in the Pacific still continued, and so the Allies sat down at Potsdam, a palace outside of Berlin, to figure out what to do with Western Europe. Germany was a microcosm of what was happening across the continent. Germany was divided into a Soviet sphere in East Germany, an American sphere in the south of Germany, and a British sphere. The capital itself, Berlin, was also divided. One big change, though, was that the American and British advocated for and demanded that the French have a part of this occupation, that the French were part of the winning Allied coalition. The Soviets really didn't want to have any part of this. The Soviets, Joseph Stalin in particular, had been dealing with the United States and Great Britain. France had capitulated early to the Nazi occupation. The British and the Americans wanted to reward Charles de Gaulle for his effort organizing the Free French. They wanted to elevate him above the partisan, or the communist movement, inside of France. De Gaulle had fled France and organized a foreign service inside of Great Britain, and he returned to France with American and British troops. The partisan movement was a communist movement by and large inside of France during the war. They had stayed and fought. The Allies feared that their popularity would give the communists a foothold in Western Europe. And so the British and the Americans wanted to boost the standing of Charles de Gaulle in Western Europe, meaning they wanted to give him a share of the occupation. And so the Americans and the British had to carve out a French sector from their territory because the Soviet Union was not going to have any of that. The ink was barely dry on the Potsdam Agreements before the United States used an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just 4 days later, on August 6th, the United States dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, and then on August 9th, dropped a second on Nagasaki. These two weapons brought an end to the war in the Pacific. This made sure that American forces didn't have to have an amphibious landing on the Japanese mainland. This picture, though, shows the level of destruction. During the war, conventional weapons were pretty deadly. They could level buildings, they could set fire with firebombs, and they caused an incredible amount of terror. These were different, though, because in a matter of seconds, entire cities simply evaporated. Stalin had no idea that the Americans possessed the bomb. Roosevelt had kept this a secret from nearly everyone. Even Harry Truman, who was his vice president, didn't know about the Manhattan Project. And so when the United States dropped the bomb on August 6th and August 9th, this increased the level of suspicion and mistrust in Stalin's mind. Stalin was already a paranoid personality to begin with, but when the Americans dropped this bomb, it sent him into a fever pitch. Stalin saw Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. It would be his airbag in case of another war with Western Europe. Napoleon had invaded, the British and the French in the Crimean War, they had invaded, the Japanese had invaded, the Germans invaded again after World War and during World War I. The American, the French, the British, and the Japanese all invaded during the Civil War to try to stop the Bolshevik Revolution. And so Stalin wanted a buffer zone or an airbag between him and Western Europe. He was pretty confident that Western Europe was going to punch him again, and Eastern Europe was going to absorb the blow before it ever hit the Soviet people. One thing standing in the way of that buffer zone was his promise to have free elections. All of the Allies had committed to free elections after the end of the war. This was a commitment for that new world. This was something Roosevelt insisted on. In particular, exiles like the Free Polish movement had fled their country during World War II. They fled and organized in England. This was a very common experience for dissenters in the 19th and the 20th century. Move to another country, continue to write, continue to agitate, and then when the time is right, come back and try to take control of the situation. And so these Free Polish intellectuals and politicians thought that at the end of the war, they would be able to go back to Poland and compete in free and fair elections. Joseph Stalin wanted none of this. Joseph Stalin held elections, and everyone was able to vote for the Communist Party candidate of their choice. This, for Stalin, was a free election. By today's standards, this seems incredibly absurd. But remember, in 1945, the United States still practiced Jim Crow. Jim Crow limited the ability of African Americans to participate in elections in the South. The United States also had restricted women from voting. And so while women had gained the right to vote, they were still limited in their ability to exercise that right. And so Stalin simply took this a step further and said, why should he allow anyone who's going to vote for the destruction of their own country, like the fascists, to vote? The only people that should be able to compete for elections are people committed to communism. That was Stalin's definition of a free election. Winston Churchill formulated the Western response to the events in Eastern Europe. He was out of office, and so he went on a speaking tour, and he was invited to speak at Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946. Here he delivered one of the most famous speeches in 20th century European history, the Iron Curtain speech. He said that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An Iron Curtain descended across the continent. This image of an Iron Curtain was figurative. It was a metaphor. There was no hard curtain or wall at the time. What Churchill was talking about was the ever-increasing control from Moscow, that Joseph Stalin was not allowing free and fair elections in Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, that Stalin was controlling events. And then Winston Churchill raised a very interesting question. What were the limits of Soviet expansion? Churchill was placing in the Western mind the idea that this was not the end of Stalin's dreams, that Stalin wanted to continue that international communist movement for the workers of the world to unite. This brought up the specter of Adolf Hitler, that when the Western powers appeased Hitler before World War II, they gave him a green light to expand. Churchill didn't say it, but he implied that if the Allies allowed Stalin to take control of Eastern Europe, he would then march on to Western Europe. But Churchill knew and understood Stalin's motives. He was there at the Moscow Agreement. He was there at the Yalta Agreement. He was there at Potsdam. Churchill was using this moment to boost his political fortune so that he could get back in office in Great Britain. He was also calling attention to the threat to the stability in southeastern Europe, in Greece and then Turkey. The Greek and Turkish governments were military dictatorships. They were authoritarian regimes. Both had communist, leftist, socialist rebellions at the end of World War II. The Nazis had occupied Greece and Turkey. They had collaborator governments. When Nazi forces pulled back, the partisan movements that had been fighting against the Nazis turned their attention to the new governments at the end of World War II. The partisans wanted the control for themselves. Winston Churchill pointed to these two rebellion movements and asked the United States to help stop the spread of communism. Over the next year, American President Harry Truman became convinced that Churchill was right. And so in March of 1947, Truman announced the containment policy, or the Truman Doctrine, that the United States would resist communist expansion anywhere in the world. The one criteria for U.S. aid and U.S. help was those receiving the help had to be anti-communist. They had to be committed to stopping the spread of communism. This opened up the flow of U.S. foreign aid, first and foremost, to Greece and Turkey. The Greek government, the Turkish government, welcomed American military and economic assistance. Neither one of these governments were democratically elected governments. Instead, they were authoritarian regimes. It didn't matter to the United States. What mattered is that they were committed to fighting communism. This was the beginning of American foreign aid. The United States, before World War II, did not give military and economic assistance. This changed during the war, when Franklin Roosevelt began the Lend-Lease program and began funding the British and French efforts against the Nazis. The United States then continued that type of foreign assistance during the Cold War. The United States would prop up any government that stood against communist rebels. The Truman Doctrine then started to promote American economic interest, the development of free market capitalism. And so the United States put forth an aid program called the Marshall Plan for anyone in Western Europe that was going to adopt free market principles. And so the Marshall Plan gave $23 billion to European countries to rebuild their roads, their bridges, their factories, and to set them back on the path to free market capitalism. In today's dollars, that's somewhere between $240 and $250 billion. The Soviets responded with their own economic plan, Comecon, the communist economy. Instead of free market capitalism, this would be based on Soviet principles of a command economy and socialism. All property in the Soviet sphere would be publicly run, and all of those factories, all of those homes would be directed from Moscow. So just as Joseph Stalin had developed 5-year plans for Soviet development in the 1930s, the Soviets continued that economic planning after World War II. Military divisions between the two sides also hardened. The United States formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was to defend against an incoming Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The Soviets responded by creating their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This would be directed under the Soviet military to stop the capitalist pigs from invading Eastern Europe. So just from 1945 to 1947 then, the alliance that won World War II quickly broke down and deteriorated into an antagonistic relationship. Neither side trusted the other. Stalin was afraid of a Western European invasion, and so he took his position in Eastern Europe and solidified it to prevent another Western European attack. The Western powers huddled around the United States. They wanted the United States to stay engaged after World War II. After World War I, the United States walked away from Europe. The Western powers were afraid that the United States would do it again. The Western powers were afraid that they would be left in Europe with a massive Soviet army building in the East. And so they asked for and got a commitment for U.S. presence as NATO to defend against any incoming Soviet threat. So the post-war settlement was not based on a period of cooperation and alliance building. Instead, the post-war settlement further divided Europe between an Eastern Bloc and a Western Bloc. A Cold War had emerged.